Holy gutter trash. The words dripped from Donald Trump's mouth like acid, cutting across the marble chamber. It wasn't policy, it was a public execution of dignity. For a moment, the room chuckled, but laughter dies fast when the truth has teeth. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. In her left hand, a pair of worn dog tags pressed into her skin, a reminder of the father Trump had just spat on. This wasn't the first time he'd gone after someone's legacy. In his career, over 217 civil cases have accused him of housing fraud, predatory development, or denial of services. 37 involving government-backed funds meant for the poor. And now on live national television, he'd chosen to humiliate a preacher's daughter in front of a country still scarred by injustice. What he didn't know was that in the next 3 minutes, she would turn his insult into a reckoning the nation would never forget. Not with shouting, not with rage, but with a precision that would cut deeper than any microphone ever could. The first strike of wood cracked through the chamber like a rifle shot. It wasn't just a call to order, it was a warning, the kind that told you the next few minutes would live in headlines, in memory, in history books. Cameras swung toward the center table, hungry for the moment the world had been primed to see. Donald J. Trump, the man who built his brand on invincibility, staring down the congresswoman he'd just tried to humiliate. He sat like a monarch on borrowed time, chin high, smirk carved into stone, shoulders wide as if the marble columns behind him were there to hold him up, not the other way around. 3 seats away, Jasmine Crockett didn't even glance at him. Not yet. Her gaze was anchored to some invisible horizon only she could see. Her left hand, tucked beneath the lip of the table, was clenched so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. Something metallic pressed into her palm, edges biting into skin. She could feel the faint grooves of a name stamped into metal. Her father's name. The air between them was already charged. It smelled faintly of old paper in the ozone before lightning hits. There was a taste to it, sharp, metallic, like the moment before a storm tears the sky open. A cough echoed from somewhere in the gallery, too loud in the silence. Even the shuffling of papers felt intrusive, like an audience member talking during a funeral. Trump shifted in his chair. It was subtle, but the cameras caught it. He adjusted his tie with 2 short jerks, the way a man does when he's pretending he isn't feeling heat. His eyes drifted toward her, briefly, and then away, as if even that fleeting glance had cost him something. The insult he'd just hurled still hung in the air, like smoke that refused to clear. Holy gutter trash. It wasn't new for Jasmine to hear words like that. She'd grown up watching her father's sermons be dismissed, mocked, or ignored because they were preached in a basement and not from a stage wrapped in gold leaf. But today wasn't about enduring insults. It was about what came after. She breathed in slowly, letting the air settle into her chest. Not to calm herself. She didn't need calming, but to steady the ground beneath her next move. On her right, a Democrat shifted forward, already looking uneasy. On her left, 2 Republican aides whispered behind cupped hands, their shoulders shaking with the aftershock of laughter. Jasmine didn't turn to look at them. She let the whispers burn themselves out. Trump leaned back in his chair now, arms spread wide, the picture of ease. But there was a twitch in the corner of his jaw, the kind you only see when someone is holding something back, either a deeper insult or a crack in the armor. She saw it. She filed it away. The gavel struck again, sharper this time, like it was urging the hearing to begin before the tension ripped the walls down. From the corner of her eye, Jasmine caught the camera's red light blinking, live, every second, every breath. And somewhere beyond the glass lenses and satellite feeds, millions of people were watching, many of them over 50, many of them carrying their own history with insults like the one Trump had just delivered. They knew what it was to be dismissed, to be reduced to where you came from instead of what you'd built. Trump leaned toward the microphone, his voice thick with that same oily confidence. "This isn't about housing," he said, every syllable slow and deliberate. "It's about turning sermons into subsidies, about pretending basement preaching is the same as building cities." The Republican bench erupted in low, rolling laughter. One congressman slapped the table twice. Another leaned toward his neighbor, whispering something that made both of them snort into their hands. Jasmine didn't move. Her thumb traced the metal in her palm, feeling the dent in the edge where the dog tags had been dropped once on a concrete floor decades ago. She remembered the sound. She remembered the way her father had picked them up and slipped them back over his neck like it was the most natural thing in the world. Those tags had been to war zones without weapons, refugee camps without fences, churches without roofs. They had never been touched by a man like Trump, and she wasn't about to let him be the first. The camera on her side caught a close-up, her profile against the backdrop of the American flag, jawline still as marble. Viewers at home wouldn't see the tension in her grip, but they would feel the energy pressing through the screen. It was the kind of silence that unnerves. Not the absence of sound, but the weight of something unsaid that's seconds away from detonating. From across the table, Trump spoke again, softer this time, but with an edge meant to cut. 30 nobodies in a shack. That's your father's empire. He expected her to look up. She didn't. Instead, she reached for a leather binder at her side, fingers brushing against the spine as if it were a living thing. She didn't open it yet. She just let her hand rest there, the way a musician might hover over a piano key before the first note. Somewhere behind the cameras, a photographer adjusted his lens. The click echoed through the chamber like the cock of a rifle. Jasmine finally looked up, not at Trump, but past him, over his shoulder, as though searching for something he couldn't see. And for a fleeting second, the smirk faltered. Not much, just enough for the camera to catch it. The audience wouldn't know what she was holding or why she hadn't spoken yet. But they'd know this. Whatever came next was going to hurt him more than any shouted rebuttal ever could. The gavel came down a third time. The hearing was officially in session, and Jasmine Crockett was done waiting. Trump leaned forward, elbows spread wide as if claiming the whole table belonged to him. The microphone caught the faint rasp in his throat, but his voice poured out smooth, like oil sliding over gravel. Your father? 30 people in a shack. I house 30,000 in one tower. It landed like a slap wrapped in silk, sharp, then smug. Laughter didn't just break out, it detonated. Across the Republican bench, the sound rolled like a wave off tin roofs in a summer storm, metallic, hollow, but loud enough to bruise. It wasn't polite chuckling. It was the kind of laughter that leans forward, showing teeth, the kind that feeds on someone else's humiliation. One congressman from Florida clapped twice, as if rewarding a particularly clever joke. Another from Arkansas leaned toward his seatmate, whispering something that made the man's eyes crinkle into delighted slits. A junior aide at the far end of the table threw his head back so far his chair squeaked against the marble floor. No one shushed him. Trump didn't join in their laughter. Not directly. He just sat there, soaking it in like applause after a performance he'd rehearsed for years. His gaze drifted toward Jasmine, slow and deliberate, the way a hunter studies prey already caught in the snare. He didn't blink. If he expected her to flinch, he was about to be disappointed. Jasmine didn't move. Her back stayed straight, her shoulders squared. The only sign she'd heard him at all was the way her right hand relaxed just enough for her fingertips to brush the leather cover of her binder. Trump went in again, sensing what he thought was momentum. That's the difference, folks. That's success. While your daddy was reading verses to nobodies in a basement, I was rewriting skylines. The laughter came again, hotter now, riding on the scent of blood in the water. He tilted his head, let the corner of his mouth curl upward, half grin, half sneer. To his audience, it was dominance. To Jasmine, it was noise. She blinked once, slow, as if giving his words time to wither in the air. A flicker of memory crossed her mind. Her father standing in that same basement he mocked, speaking to a handful of people with voices so quiet you could hear the hum of the old fluorescent lights overhead. No marble, no polished wood, no cameras, just words. And the kind of faith that built people instead of towers. Trump leaned closer to the mic, his voice dropping just enough to sound confidential, like he was letting the nation in on a private truth. He gave speeches in basement churches. I gave jobs in penthouses. You tell me who history will remember. The room stirred again. Low murmurs, muffled chuckles. A camera operator in the back shifted position, lens trained on Jasmine's face. If the viewers expected an outburst, they weren't going to get one. Not yet. Instead, Jasmine's gaze lifted, Not toward Trump, but toward the rows of aides behind him. Her eyes found one young man who'd been laughing loudest. She held his gaze just long enough for the smile to vanish from his mouth. Then she looked back down at her binder. Trump didn't notice the exchange. He was too busy turning his chair slightly toward the cameras, making sure the gold thread in his tie caught the light. "People like her," he said, gesturing with an open palm toward Jasmine. "They love to talk about legacy." "What legacy?" Her dad read from a book while I signed checks that moved mountains. The words bounced around the chamber, but they didn't stick to her. Her fingers traced the binder's spine, sliding slowly toward the metal clasp. She wasn't opening it yet, just marking the moment. The sound in the room shifted. The laughter was still there, but under it was something else. A faint tension, like the creak of wood before it snaps. Even those on his side knew the rhythm. Too many blows in a row, and the target either crumbles or fires back. And Jasmine Crockett was not built to crumble. Trump wasn't finished. He gave sermons in rooms with no windows. "I built towers that scrape heaven." He let the pause hang, then tilted his head toward her. "You want to build America? Start with steel, not scripture." A flash from the press pit caught the edge of her jawline. It would make the papers tomorrow. The image of a woman carved in stillness while a storm tried to rattle her. She inhaled once, deeply enough for her chest to rise against the navy fabric of her blazer. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and cheap cologne. Her father's cologne had been different. Cedar and soap, nothing fancy. Just enough to say he'd made himself ready before speaking to anyone. Whether it was 30 people or 3,000. The laughter tapered, not because Trump had stopped talking, but because the room could feel something shift. It was in the way Jasmine's shoulders squared a little more, in the way her fingers stopped tracing the binder and curled over the edge like they were ready to lift the lid on something dangerous. Trump noticed it too. His smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed, just slightly. He'd been in enough fights to recognize the moment before a counterpunch. Somewhere above, the old lights hummed, casting their glare across the table. The microphones picked up the faint shuffle of paper, the subtle intake of breath from someone in the gallery who knew what was coming. Jasmine shifted in her chair, finally turning her face toward him. Not all the way, just enough for the cameras to catch the movement. Her eyes locked on his, steady, unblinking. And for the first time since he opened his mouth, Donald Trump looked away. It wasn't long, a second, maybe less. But in a hearing like this, on a day like this, 1 second was enough for millions of viewers to feel it in their gut. The predator had blinked, and Jasmine Crockett, still silent, still holding her father's name in the palm of her hand, was just getting started. No reaction. Her spine was a column of steel, unmoving, unshaken. Her gaze was fixed somewhere beyond him, through him, as if Donald Trump were nothing more than a blur in her peripheral vision. Beneath the table, the dog tag's metal edges bit into her palm. They carved a faint red line across her skin. She didn't flinch. She let the pain root her, not wound her. The room was still echoing with the laughter he had summoned. It bounced off marble, ricocheted off wood, but couldn't touch her. A TV camera zoomed tight on her profile. Viewers at home would see a woman frozen in poise, but they wouldn't see the tiny tremor in the metal chain as her fingers flexed. That tremor wasn't fear, it was restraint. Trump leaned back, clearly expecting some retort. An interruption, a breaking point he could sink his teeth into. Instead, he found the one thing he could not control. Nothing. The kind of nothing that unsettles because it is deliberate. Every second she stayed silent, the balance in the room shifted by degrees. The laughter lost a little of its confidence. The smirks faded a fraction. Even on his own side of the aisle, some eyes darted between her stillness and his swagger, sensing the collision course they were on. She let her eyes drift, not toward Trump, but toward the farthest end of the table. An aide there had been laughing harder than anyone. She looked at him just long enough for the grin to fall from his face. Then she looked away, dismissing him without a word. That dismissal hit harder than any insult could have. Her mind flickered back for a moment, to another table, another room, decades earlier. Her father, Joseph Crockett, had sat with his hands folded over those same tags, speaking to her about dignity. "Sometimes the strongest thing you can do," he had said, "is make the other man speak into the silence you hold." That memory wrapped around her now like armor. Trump cleared his throat. Not because he needed to, but because the silence she held was pressing into him. It was subtle, just a faint shift in his shoulders, but the camera caught it. She didn't move. Someone in the gallery coughed. A pen rolled off a desk and clinked against the floor. Every small sound felt louder in her silence, amplified by the stillness she commanded. Trump spoke again, his tone sharpening just slightly. She's not speaking because she's got nothing to say. That's the problem with these legacy types. They inherit words, not results. A few chuckles answered him, but they were thinner now, forced. Jasmine kept her gaze forward, chin steady. Her hands stayed where they were. One on the binder, one beneath the table, cradling the tags as though their weight could anchor her to the ground. She could feel her heartbeat in her palm. Each pulse was a drumbeat telling her to wait. The chairwoman shifted in her seat. A Democrat down the line scribbled something on a slip of paper and slid it toward Jasmine. She didn't look. She didn't need prompts. Trump gestured with both hands, palms up as if presenting a case. This is what happens when you come to politics with nothing but a sermon in your pocket. You get lost. You get quiet. And America doesn't have time for quiet. He smiled, expecting the room to follow him, but the room was starting to follow her. That was the thing about stillness. It made people curious. They wanted to know what you were holding back. They started to lean forward, to listen harder, to watch for the crack in the dam. And Jasmine Crockett had built her dam high. Her eyes finally shifted, to the Bible in her binder, to the spine worn thin from decades of being opened. Her father's initials were still faintly pressed into the leather. She remembered him carrying it to hospital beds, to prison cells, to funerals where the only mourners were strangers. He had never raised his voice, but he had never needed to. That memory steadied her breath. Trump's voice droned on, filling the air with boasts about towers and cities, about jobs and deals, about steel and glass. He didn't notice that some of the faces on his side were starting to turn neutral. He didn't see the aides shifting uncomfortably. He didn't hear the weight in the air changing, but she did. Her thumb brushed the tags one more time, feeling the grooves of her father's name. She pictured the moment she would open the binder, place the Bible on the table, and let the room see what real legacy looked like. Not yet. One more beat. A camera light blinked again, red and unblinking. Somewhere, millions were watching, waiting for her to speak. She wasn't going to give them words. Not yet. She was going to give them something stronger. The image of a woman who refused to be moved by mockery, who could take every ounce of venom and still sit straighter than the man throwing it. In the silence, Trump filled the space with more of himself. But the more he spoke, the more it felt like he was talking to fill a void he couldn't understand. Her void. And in that, she was already winning. Without a word, she moved. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate. Like the slow opening of a vault you're not sure the room deserves to see inside. Her right hand left the binder's spine and reached down. The movement was small, almost unnoticeable, but the cameras caught it. The leather appeared first, worn and cracked, the color dulled to a deep, bruised brown. She set it on the table. Not a thud, not a slap. Just the soft landing of something that had outlasted storms. The gold letters across the cover were almost gone, rubbed away by decades of use. Only the faintest glint remained, catching the overhead light like a whisper of the past refusing to fade completely. Donald Trump's eyes flicked toward it. Once, then away as if to pretend it was nothing. Jasmine didn't look at him. She opened the Bible slowly, the hinges of the binding sighing with the weight of age. She flipped through pages yellowed and frayed at the edges, each one carrying the ghost of a fingerprint or the shadow of a sermon once spoken. Then she stopped. Her hand rested on a page marked by a strip of ribbon so faded it was more thread than fabric. The handwriting was there in the margin, ink long faded, but the words still defiant. Slanted script, black fountain pen. Build men, not monuments. The letters were underlined twice, the pen digging into the paper hard enough to have left an impression on the page beneath. She turned the book sideways, not toward herself, not toward him. She slid it forward into the neutral space between them, the no man's land of the hearing table. The laughter in the room stumbled, then stopped. It wasn't because they understood the quote. It was because they felt the weight of the act. Trump's smirk froze for half a heartbeat before he forced it back onto his face. Jasmine's hands folded lightly in front of her, resting against the edge of the binder. She didn't speak. She didn't explain. The silence stretched out, taut and unbroken. Somewhere behind her, a chair creaked as someone shifted forward to get a better view of the page. The cameras zoomed. The networks cut to a split screen. Trump on one side, the Bible on the other. The quote filled television screens across the country in letters that looked like they had been written for someone specific, even if that someone had never met Joseph Crockett. Trump leaned back, eyes darting between the book and the cameras. For a man used to controlling the narrative, it was a dangerous shift, one where the story was no longer his to command. Jasmine's stillness amplified the moment. She was no longer just enduring his presence. She was anchoring the room. The hearing had started as his stage. Now it felt like hers. A murmur ran through the gallery. Not loud enough to be scolded, but present enough to change the air. Even those who had laughed minutes earlier seemed caught between curiosity and discomfort. Trump finally leaned forward, forcing his voice into the gap. "Here we go," he muttered almost under his breath, but loud enough for the microphones to catch. He gestured toward the Bible with a flick of his fingers, as though brushing dust off the moment. "A book isn't going to build houses." No laughter came this time. Not from his bench, not from anywhere. Jasmine's eyes finally lifted to meet his. Not burning, not accusing, just steady. And in that steadiness was something sharp, a precision that didn't need volume to wound. It was the kind of look that made a person realize they were standing in a place where their name might not outlast the moment. Trump shifted in his chair. The movement was small, but for someone who had walked into the room like marble, it was enough to show a crack. The quote sat there between them, unmoving. "Build men, not monuments." It didn't accuse him. It didn't even mention him. But it unmade the foundation he had built his argument on. One boast at a time. A camera cut to the gallery again. Several spectators had their eyes on the book, lips moving silently as they read the words for themselves. One older man in the second row leaned back, crossing his arms. His smirk was gone. Jasmine didn't move the book back. She didn't claim it. It sat in that space like a challenge, daring him to cross the line and touch it. He didn't. The hearing room, so noisy minutes ago, had turned into something else entirely. Not a courtroom, not a committee chamber, something older, something closer to a sanctuary. And the only sermon being preached was the one written in faded ink decades before. Aides on his side began looking down at their notes, some flipping pages unnecessarily just to avoid the sight of the quote. Trump straightened his tie again, his fingers moving faster than before. Jasmine kept her hands still, her posture unbroken. She didn't need to raise her voice, because in that moment, the Bible between them was louder than either of them could ever speak. For a long moment, no one moved. The silence wasn't empty, it was loaded, like the pause before a final verdict. Then a sound. A chair scraped against the marble. Not from the press pit, not from the audience, but from the second row of the senator's bench. A man rose, slowly as if standing carried weight. Senator Raphael Warro. No one had expected him to move. He wasn't on the docket to speak. He wasn't even sitting near the microphone. Yet here he was, stepping forward, one hand braced on the desk as though gathering more than balance. His voice, when it came, wasn't loud. It cracked on the first word. "I was 15, he began, and I slept under church pews in Savannah." The laughter that had clung to the walls minutes earlier was gone. Every eye shifted toward him. "I'd run from a shelter. I was cold. I was invisible. And one night, I broke into a basement just to get out of the wind." He paused, not for effect, but because the memory was catching up to him. "I thought I was alone. I wasn't. There was a man mopping the floor. He didn't yell. He didn't call the cops. He looked at me like I wasn't trash." His voice thinned, but he didn't stop. That man was Reverend Joseph Crockett. A ripple went through the chamber, small but undeniable. Even those who hadn't heard the name before now saw it written on the open Bible between Jasmine and Trump. "He gave me food, then a blanket, then a reason to wake up the next day." Warro's hand flexed at his side. "I sit here today, in this chamber, because of that man." Trump shifted in his seat, jaw tightening. but said nothing. Somewhere in the gallery, the faint click of a camera shutter captured the senator's face, creased, wet at the corners of his eyes. Warro stepped back, letting the weight of his words settle. No applause, no murmurs, just stillness. Then the sound of movement again, this time from the gallery. A figure limped down the aisle between the rows of spectators. A veteran. His gait was uneven, his right leg stiff. His uniform was long gone, but the pin on his lapel caught the light with each step. He carried something folded in his hands. The cloth was dark, frayed at the edges, the way fabric looks after decades of keeping too many stories. When he reached the table, he didn't look at Trump. He looked at Jasmine. "My boy," he said, his voice rough, "died in 2006. Army medic. Came home with shrapnel in his back and pain no doctor could see." He swallowed. "The church we belonged to for 20 years wouldn't bury him. They said what he'd done overseas disqualified him from grace." A murmur swept the room. Not outrage, not yet, but the kind of disbelief that draws people tighter into the story. The veteran's voice softened. "Reverend Crockett never met my son in life, but he stood at his graveside when no one else would. He gave him a home in death when this country didn't know what to do with him alive." He placed the folded cloth on the table beside the Bible. It wasn't just cloth. It was a funeral sash, the kind used to drape coffins in Reverend Crockett's first church. He looked at it, then back at Jasmine. "He told me it had wrapped too many forgotten bodies, and that my son would not be one of them." The room didn't breathe. No coughs, no shifting in chairs. Reporters had their hands on their keyboards, but no one typed. The sound that followed wasn't applause. It was the hollow, resonant thud of truth hitting marble, settling in places even the cameras couldn't capture. Jasmine's eyes lowered briefly to the sash, then lifted to meet the veteran's. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. The recognition in her gaze was enough to close the loop between them. A silent acknowledgement that his story was now part of this moment, part of her father's record. Trump looked down at the table, his eyes darting between the Bible and the sash. For a man who had spent his life building monuments to himself, the sight of two objects so plain and yet so heavy with meaning must have felt foreign. The veteran stepped back. No one followed him. No security stopped him. He walked with the same deliberate limp back up the aisle, each step echoing in the marble chamber. The sash and the Bible remained where they were, unmoved, unmovable. From somewhere in the back, a voice murmured low enough that it wasn't caught on the mics. "That's not just her father's legacy, that's America's conscience." Whether it was meant to be heard or not, the truth of it seemed to hang in the air, just above the weight on the table. The hearing, once loud and biting, had shifted into something else entirely. It wasn't about housing now. It wasn't even about policy. It was about who gets remembered and who decides. And in that battle, Jasmine Crockett had just been joined by ghosts her opponent could never erase. Jasmine's hand moved at last, not toward the Bible, not toward the funeral sash. She reached for the leather binder at her elbow and slid a slim tablet from its pocket. The screen lit her face in a pale glow, sharp against the warm tones of the chamber. A tap, and then the room changed. The monitors mounted along the walls, normally reserved for dry charts and legal citations, flickered to life. The first image was a contract, digital text, clean and sharp, the kind of document that didn't need narration to wound. At the bottom, a signature looped in bold, unmistakable strokes. Donald J. Trump. "Affordable Housing Initiative," the header read. "South Dallas Veterans Project, 82 units. A few senators leaned forward, squinting at the date in the top right corner. Trump's lawyers stiffened. Jasmine's voice when it came was steady, almost clinical. "This contract," she said, "would have built 82 homes in my district for veterans, single mothers, and families living 3 to a room." She tapped the screen again. The contract dissolved into another document, a bank transfer record. Line items in black and white. Funds routed out of Dallas and into the Midtown Tower project in Manhattan. The money, she continued, was diverted to luxury condos 3 states away. South Dallas got 0 bricks. Not one nail, not one door. Trump's smirk was still there, but it had tightened. The corners of his mouth twitched with the strain of holding the expression in place. A third tap. The monitors switched to an email. The header read, "From Brandon K. Heller, Assistant Director, Trump Development Group, to Donald J. Trump." The body was brief. "As you requested, I ran the projected ROI on the Crockett Commons initiative. Poor people don't pay. South Dallas is a loss. Recommend we reroute to Midtown." The words hit the room like a dropped hammer. Gasps rose, not scripted, not polite. They came from deep in the chests of people who understood exactly what had just been laid bare. Jasmine didn't look at the reaction. She kept her gaze forward, her tone even. "This email was obtained under subpoena. It is dated 2 weeks before the South Dallas project was canceled. Mr. Heller is currently under sealed federal investigation." A camera swung to Trump. His smirk hadn't fully broken, but the eyes above it were different now. Harder, narrower, calculating the damage. Jasmine tapped again. The screen filled with a photograph, an empty lot in South Dallas, weeds curling through cracked dirt. In the corner, an old billboard leaned on rusted supports. Its faded lettering still read, "Future home of Crockett Commons, affordable living for all." In the center of the photo stood Joseph Crockett, clipboard in hand, eyes full of a hope that, in the picture, still felt like it might carry the day. The silence in the chamber thickened. This wasn't just about numbers anymore. It was about what those numbers had taken. Jasmine's voice cut through like a slow blade. "You say you build cities. I say you leave empty lots where promises were meant to stand." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Trump leaned toward his microphone, but his lawyer touched his arm. It wasn't the gesture of someone calming a client. It was the grip of someone who knew speaking now could bleed more than it could save. Another tap. Now the screen showed a timeline. 2 columns, one for the South Dallas project, one for the Midtown Tower. Every date on the left stopped 2 weeks before construction was to begin. Every date on the right surged forward in parallel, funded in full. 82 homes for veterans, Jasmine said, gone in favor of penthouses for the wealthy. And this, she pointed toward the screen, isn't the only example. She swiped left. A cascade of case numbers rolled down the monitors. 217 civil cases tied to Trump's name, all related to housing fraud, predatory development, or denial of services. 37 involving government-backed funds. The numbers didn't need adjectives. They carried their own gravity. In the gallery, someone muttered, "Jesus Christ," forgetting the microphone in front of them was still hot. The phrase leaked into the broadcast feed before anyone could cut it. Jasmine's eyes stayed locked on the monitors. These are not stories. They are records. Signed, dated, verified. She turned her head slowly, meeting Trump's eyes for the first time since she had placed the Bible on the table. For a heartbeat, neither moved. It was a collision without sound. 2 gazes meeting in a place the microphones couldn't reach. Then she spoke again, her voice almost softer than before. "When you took those funds, you didn't just cancel a project. You canceled futures." The words settled like ash after a fire. Not loud, not explosive, but covering everything. The Bible, the sash, the contract glowing coldly on the monitors. Trump's smirk had stopped twitching. It was gone now, replaced by the flat expression of a man calculating his next move in a fight he thought would be theater, not trial. And Jasmine Crockett, without raising her voice, had turned the hearing into a courtroom. A courtroom where the evidence was already on the walls for everyone to see. It started quietly. A tone chimed from the chairwoman's phone. Muted, almost lost under the hum of the chamber. But a staffer 2 rows back leaned in toward her own device, eyes widening. A call had come through the live public feed. The voice on the line was thin, almost trembling, but steady enough to carry. "I was 12, the caller said, "when Reverend Crockett let my family sleep in the church." No preamble, no title, just a memory thrown like a stone into still water. Cameras shifted, not toward the caller. They couldn't, but toward Jasmine, as if the room instinctively knew the story belonged to her. The voice continued. "My mother cleaned houses during the day. We had nowhere to go at night. He gave us blankets. He gave us a door that stayed unlocked." The line crackled, then went silent. For a heartbeat, no one reacted. Then, like a fuse catching, the glow began. On screens outside the chamber, on laptops in coffee shops, on phones in living rooms from Maine to California, a single phrase began to appear. Crockett built me. At first it was a trickle, 3 posts, then 7, then dozens. A teacher in Tulsa, a firefighter in Atlanta, a retired judge from Maryland, different cities, different lives, the same sentence beneath each post. He saved me. Inside the hearing, no one mentioned it yet, but outside, the country was starting to lean in. Cable news tickers updated mid-broadcast. Local stations cut away from traffic reports to read tweets out loud. By the time the chairwoman's aide whispered in her ear, the tag had already crossed 50,000 mentions. Jasmine didn't check her phone. She didn't need to. She could feel the shift, the way a tide pulls before you see the waves. One post came from a man in Detroit. He found me sleeping behind the church dumpster, fed me, clothed me, sent me to school. I own my own business now. Crockett built me. Another from a woman in Phoenix. He officiated my parents' wedding for free, then showed up every year on their anniversary with flowers. Your Crockett built me. The hearing was no longer just in that room. It was in living rooms, on buses, in waiting rooms where the TV hung high on the wall and strangers watched together. Trump shifted in his chair, glancing at the monitors as if expecting the post to disappear. They didn't. Instead, a live counter in the corner of the news broadcast ticked upward, digit by digit. 100,000, 120,000. A Fox News producer somewhere in Midtown Manhattan barked into a headset, "Do we ignore this or pivot?" No one answered fast enough. Back in the chamber, the hashtag leapt again. A photo surfaced, grainy, black and white, of a young Joseph Crockett holding a broom in one hand and a laughing child in the other. The caption, "He taught me to sweep before I could read. I own 3 janitorial companies now. Crockett built me." A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Reporters began typing furiously, not just notes but quotes, snippets from posts pouring in faster than they could copy. Then came the post that cracked the dam. A county sheriff from Alabama wrote, "He prayed with me in a holding cell the night before I decided not to take my own life. I've worn this badge for 19 years. Not sure Crockett built me." It was retweeted 5,000 times in under a minute. Trump's smirk was gone now. Not cracked. Gone. His fingers tapped an uneven rhythm on the table, a tell the cameras caught in merciless close-up. Jasmine still hadn't spoken. She sat in the same stillness she'd carried all morning, letting the movement build around her like a rising drumbeat. She understood something he didn't. You can't out-talk a story once it belongs to the people. On CNN, a split screen appeared. Live footage of the hearing on one side, a scrolling feed of Lach Crockett built me on the other. The comments blurred into a kind of living testimony. He taught me to read. He paid my rent once. He visited my mother in hospice. He told me I wasn't a mistake. The count passed 200,000. Trending gibberish one nationwide. A radio DJ in Chicago interrupted a song to read 3 posts on air. In a diner in Ohio, an elderly couple watched from their booth, tears slipping silently down their cheeks. For every boast Trump had made about towers and skylines, a story appeared that built something else. Something taller, something harder to tear down. The contrast wasn't subtle, it was brutal. Trump finally leaned toward his microphone, as if ready to reclaim the room. But the chairwoman glanced at the clock and shook her head. "It's on the record," she said simply. And with that, the feed rolled on, unstoppable. Jasmine's eyes dropped briefly to the Bible, then to the sash. She didn't smile, but there was a flicker. A quiet acknowledgement that her father's voice had found a way back into the room, and it wasn't leaving. By the time the hearing broke for recess, the hashtag had crossed 350,000 mentions. Cable hosts were already calling it the Crockett effect. And somewhere, in homes across America, people who had never heard of Jasmine Crockett's father were beginning to remember their own. It happened so quietly it almost didn't register at first. A chair scraped on polished marble. Not rushed, not hesitant, but with the steady weight of a decision that couldn't be taken back. From Trump's side of the aisle, a man rose. Representative William Harrow, Republican, 3-term congressman from Ohio, not known for rebellion, not known for speaking out of turn. His movements were deliberate, like each step was an unspoken statement. He didn't glance at the cameras. He didn't ask for the chairwoman's permission. He simply began walking toward Jasmine's desk. The sound of his shoes echoed in the chamber, filling the space where moments earlier the air had been thick with hashtags and murmured stories. Jasmine's eyes tracked him only when he was halfway there. Her posture didn't change. She didn't know what he was carrying in his hand until the light caught it. Soft, warm, worn down at the edges. A small wooden cross. Not new, not polished. The kind of cross that had been held too often. The wood darkened where fingertips had pressed into it over years. When he reached her desk, Harrow didn't speak. He didn't smile. He set the cross on the table, just to the right of the Bible, beside the funeral sash. The sound it made was barely audible, more of a soft click than a drop. But in the silence, it was deafening. Trump's eyes followed it down. For the first time all morning, his jaw tightened, the muscle along his cheek pulsing once, twice. Harrow straightened, his gaze meeting Jasmine's. It wasn't the look of a man crossing the aisle politically. It was older, heavier, a kind of human recognition that has nothing to do with party lines. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. The cross sat there now like a final punctuation mark in a sentence Trump hadn't realized he'd been writing against himself. Somewhere in the gallery, a reporter's pen stilled on the page. In the press pit, cameras leaned in, hunting for the frame that would lead the evening news. The Bible, the sash, the cross. On social media, screenshots from the live feed began to circulate before Harrow even turned to walk back. The caption was simple: when the cross changed hands. Trump shifted in his seat again, this time leaning back as if to distance himself from the table. But his eyes kept drifting toward the objects. 3 small, unassuming relics that now carried the weight of the room. Harrow returned to his bench without a word. He didn't look at Trump. He didn't look at anyone on his side. The silence that followed was different now, not heavy with tension, but with the acknowledgement that something irreversible had just happened. Even the aides who had been whispering earlier kept their eyes down, as if looking at Jasmine now might draw them into whatever unspoken current had pulled Harrow forward. Jasmine's gaze returned to the table. Her father's Bible, the funeral sash from a soldier's grave, the cross from a man who, until 5 minutes ago, had no reason to stand anywhere near her. 3 artifacts, 3 testimonies without words. She rested her fingertips lightly on the edge of the cross, not claiming it, just acknowledging it, before pulling her hand back. It stayed in place, catching the chamber light. The moment was impossible to spin, even for Trump, because how do you argue with something that isn't speaking, yet is saying everything? In homes across the country, viewers leaned forward, not because a fight was breaking out, but because they recognized the rarest thing in politics: sincerity that costs something. Trump's hand moved to his tie, adjusting it for the 3rd time. A tick now, no longer a gesture of control. The split screen on television showed him on the left, Jasmine on the right, and the trio of objects dead center. Every time his gaze dropped toward them, it was caught. Every time he looked away, it was caught. In the gallery, someone whispered, "That's not politics, that's confession." No one argued. The chairwoman's gavel rested motionless beside her hand. She didn't interrupt. She knew better than to break the kind of silence that was shaping the hearing more than any question or answer could. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't need to. The cross had been placed. The defection had been made. And whether or not anyone else followed, the line had been crossed. Trump exhaled sharply through his nose, the sound caught faintly on the mic. But he didn't speak. Because sometimes the most dangerous part of a battle isn't the punch. It's realizing the crowd you thought was cheering for you is starting to look the other way. Jasmine moved her hand from the cross to the leather binder at her side. The room's attention followed it instinctively, as though everyone sensed something was about to be revealed. Something heavier than any contract or photograph they'd seen so far. She slid the binder forward. The clasp clicked open with a sound far too small for the shift it caused in the air. Inside, beneath neatly stacked papers and worn correspondence, lay a single folded sheet. It had been opened and closed so many times the creases were soft, the edges slightly frayed. She lifted it with both hands, careful, almost reverent. And when she unfolded it, the paper didn't lie flat. It curled slightly, as if trying to return to the shape it had known for years. "This," she said, her voice steady but caring, "is the last set of notes my father wrote for a sermon he never got to finish." The monitors flickered as a live camera zoomed in on her hands. The penmanship was neat, deliberate, a pastor's handwriting. She read aloud. Power must be answered, not with fear, but with memory. She paused. Her eyes lifted, sweeping the room before settling on Trump. Fear forgets. Memory does not. The words didn't land like an accusation. They landed like a stone dropped into deep water, quiet at the surface but pulling hard beneath. Jasmine lowered the page just enough to see over it, her gaze never leaving him. You build walls to keep people out. A breath, measured. My father built doors so no one had to knock. The sentence seemed to still even the air vents. No shuffle of paper, no cough, no muttered aside. Across the aisle, one Republican aide shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes fixed on the table rather than her face. Trump's expression didn't change immediately, but there was the faintest narrowing at the corners of his eyes. His fingers tapped once on the desk, then stilled. He had been in enough rooms to know when a line had slipped past defenses. Jasmine let the silence stretch. She didn't rush to speak again. She knew the value of letting words breathe until the echo reached every corner. Her gaze swept briefly to the Bible, to the funeral sash, to the cross, then back to Trump. These things, she said, nodding toward the artifacts, don't exist because my father had power. They exist because he used what little he had to lift others. Trump leaned toward his mic, opening his mouth. But she cut him off without raising her voice. And every person he helped, they remember, even when no one else did, even when you would rather they didn't. The monitor switched to a side-by-side view, Jasmine on one side, the sermon notes on the other. The words "fear forgets, memory does not," hung on the right half of the screen, burned into the feed like a watermark. Viewers at home weren't just watching a hearing anymore. They were watching a reckoning. Trump adjusted his tie, again. The cameras caught it in high definition. The internet would loop that moment for days. Jasmine's tone softened, but it didn't lose its precision. You've spent your life measuring worth in what you can stack higher, shine brighter, stamp your name on. My father measured worth in who could stand taller because he'd helped lift them. A ripple moved through the gallery, part recognition, part shame. One man in the third row leaned forward, elbows on his knees, as if drawn closer by a pull he couldn't name. Trump smirked, but the smirk didn't reach his eyes. He reached for his pen, tapping it twice against his notepad before setting it down again. Jasmine placed the sermon notes flat on the table. Not in front of her, not in front of him, but in the middle. Next to the Bible, the sash, and the cross. Now there were four testaments, 4 pieces of a man's life that didn't need defending because they defended themselves. Her voice dropped to something just above a whisper, but in the stillness, it carried. You call it weakness to remember. I call it the only way we keep from repeating what breaks us. The sentence hung there. Even the chairwoman didn't try to move the hearing forward. Trump's eyes darted once to the sermon notes. Not long enough to linger, just long enough for the cameras to catch it. Jasmine sat back, folding her hands in front of her. Her shoulders didn't relax, this wasn't over, but her point had landed, and she knew it. She had cut bone, without raising her voice. In living rooms across America, people mouthed her words to themselves. Build doors so no one has to knock. Some nodded, some swallowed hard. All of them remembered someone in their own life who had done the same. And Donald Trump, for all his skyscrapers and signatures, could not build anything to match that. It happened fast. 1 second, Trump was still in his chair, jaw locked, breathing like a man trying to keep his composure. The next, he was on his feet. This is a witch hunt. The words ricocheted off the marble walls, sharp enough to slice the quiet in two. This isn't housing. It's a damn sermon. He slammed both palms on the table. The microphones popped from the force. The Bible didn't move. The cross stayed where Harrow had set it. The funeral sash barely shifted. Only the papers in front of him fluttered, like leaves caught in a sudden gust. I've built more homes than anyone in this room, he roared, turning to glare at the senators, the gallery, the cameras, anywhere his words might stick. You think I'm going to sit here and be lectured by her? By her? His finger jabbed toward Jasmine, but she didn't flinch. Across the gallery, reporters were already typing. Cameras rolled in close, catching every bead of sweat gathering along his hairline. This is politics, he barked, pounding the table again. This is lies. You're all wasting taxpayer money on a show. Jasmine didn't move, didn't blink. The calm in her stillness made his fury look louder, messier, like steel bending under heat, warping in slow, visible arcs. The chairwoman raised a hand, but he barreled on. You think you can put up your little props? His hand swept toward the Bible, the sash, the cross. And that means something? They don't mean anything. The words landed heavy, not because they were sharp, but because the moment he said them, every camera caught it. A man dismissing faith, sacrifice, and the dead on live television. Someone in the gallery let out a sharp, involuntary breath. Others just stared. You want facts? Trump snapped. You want real numbers? I've got real numbers. None of this, he pointed again, more wildly this time, is proof of anything. But the numbers he claimed to have stayed unsaid. He wasn't producing evidence. He was only swinging at shadows. The chairwoman's gavel came down once. Mr. Trump, he talked over her. They hate me because I win. I've always won. I've always... The gavel came down again, harder this time. Mr. Trump, you are out of order. But his voice rolled on, fueled now more by anger than control. You're all the same. You think if you say it enough times, people will believe it. He turned to the cameras, leaning in. Well, guess what? People know the truth. People love me. You can't cancel me. You can't... Something in the room shifted. Not physically, no one moved. But the weight of the air tilted. Because while he was talking to America, America was watching Jasmine. She still hadn't said a word. She didn't need to. The longer she stayed silent, the more his words hung naked in the space, without an opponent to bounce off of. Trump's hands clenched into fists. He looked at the Bible again, this time for just a fraction of a second, and then at the cross. The camera caught the way his eyes lingered there. He pounded the table one last time, the sound ringing through the chamber like the end of a gavel strike. Then he sat, hard, grabbing his water and taking a swallow that did nothing to cool the heat in his face. The silence that followed wasn't respect. It was assessment. Every person in the room, on every side, was processing the same thing. They had just watched him come apart. The chairwoman leaned forward. Mr. Trump, you will have your allotted time to respond to the evidence. Until then, you will not interrupt. Her tone was calm, clipped. The tone of someone who knew the cameras had captured exactly what needed to be captured. Trump didn't answer. He looked down at his papers instead, but his hands betrayed him. Fingers drumming, then stopping, then starting again. Jasmine finally moved. She reached for her father's sermon notes and slid them an inch closer to her. No words. Just the sound of paper against wood. Somehow it was louder than all his shouting had been. And in that instant, every viewer, whether they loved him or hated him, knew something had shifted. The skyscraper had swayed. The steel had bent. And no matter how much he talked in the minutes to come, the image of him red-faced and pounding a table that couldn't be moved would be the one they remembered. Jasmine rose. Not quickly, not like someone seizing a spotlight. She moved the way a shadow stretches, slow, certain, impossible to stop once it's in motion. In her right hand, something glinted, a thin silver chain looped twice around her fingers. The closer she stepped to the center of the table, the more the overhead lights caught the shape swinging at the end. Dog tags. She stopped where the Bible, the funeral sash, and the cross already lay. For a moment, she just looked at them, like she was deciding whether to add to them at all. Then she set the tags down, careful, right beside the cross. The metal hit the wood with a sharp, clean clink. The sound was small, but in that room it was seismic. The camera zoomed in. 2 words etched deep into the steel caught the light. Joseph M. Crockett, civilian chaplain. Jasmine's voice was steady when it came. He wore these in refugee camps. She didn't look at Trump. She didn't need to. No title, she continued. No weapon. Just a promise to remember the forgotten. The chain swayed once, then settled. The tiny motion drew the eye like the last ripple on a still pond. No one moved. Not in the gallery, not in the press pit. Even the chairwoman's hands were frozen on either side of her gavel. On the broadcast feed, the image now showed the 5 objects in a perfect line. Bible, funeral sash, cross, sermon notes, dog tags, 5 artifacts, 5 unspoken testimonies. The sound of that single clink lingered in viewers' minds longer than any speech could have. It had weight, and it didn't need words to carry it. Trump's eyes flicked to the tags. For just a second, his expression shifted. Not enough to read as remorse, but enough to suggest recognition. Recognition that he couldn't outtalk this. Jasmine didn't fill the air. She stepped back, returning to her seat, letting the moment stand. It was a silence with shape, with texture, an emptiness built to hold meaning, not to hide from it. In homes across America, viewers leaned in closer to their screens, not to hear what she'd say next. She wasn't saying anything, but to keep looking, because sometimes when the story is strong enough, people don't want the scene to move on. A Marine veteran in Wisconsin paused his TV and just stared at the tags. A school teacher in Georgia took a photo of the screen and sent it to her father with the words, "This is what real service looks like." In the chamber, a low hum began, not from voices, but from the equipment in the room. The kind of sound you only notice when human noise has drained away entirely. It was in that hum that the meaning crystallized. The objects on the table weren't props. They were proof. Proof of a life lived in service without chasing headlines. Proof that legacy isn't built on what bears your name, but on who carries it forward. Trump shifted in his chair, crossing his arms. It was the posture of someone pretending not to be cornered, but his eyes betrayed him. They kept drifting back to the tags. A camera caught his reflection in the polished wood of the table. Tiny, distorted, framed between the Bible and the tags. The image would make the front page by morning. Jasmine rested her hands on the desk in front of her. Not clasped, not tight, open. She had nothing to defend. The evidence, emotional and factual, was already there. The silence stretched past comfort. No one dared break it first, because breaking it would mean acknowledging you couldn't hold it. Somewhere in the gallery, a spectator swallowed hard. The sound was barely audible, but in the stillness, it landed. Jasmine glanced toward the monitors, not to see herself, but to see the row of artifacts magnified 20 feet high. 5 pieces of her father's life. 5 strikes against the version of reality Trump had tried to sell. When she finally spoke again, it wasn't to add, but to seal. They speak for themselves. That was all. 4 words. Then she leaned back, leaving them and him to sit with it. The chairwoman looked from Jasmine to Trump, then down the line of objects. She didn't call for a recess. She didn't invite response. She just let the moment breathe. Because in politics, people remember the fight, but in history, they remember the silence that ended it. Jasmine turned her head toward the nearest camera. Not hurried, not breaking eye contact with the lens until it felt personal, like she was speaking to a single person on the other side of the glass. Legacy, she said, isn't what you build for yourself. Her voice was low, deliberate, each syllable paced like it had to land before she could move to the next. It's what you leave standing in others. The words were simple, but in their simplicity, they cut through the marble, the microphones, the political theater. They cut through him. The room didn't react immediately. It took a second, 2, before the sound began. A single clap from the far left row of the Democratic bench, then another sharper from across the aisle. It spread slowly, like a tide creeping in. First Democrats, then independents. Then, after the kind of pause that told its own story, Republicans. Some clapped softly, as if testing the sound in their own ears before committing to it. Others brought their palms together hard enough to echo off the high ceilings. But they all joined. The sound rose, not a roar, not a stadium cheer, but a measured swell. Applause that wasn't for spectacle, but for acknowledgement. Cameras panned, catching faces. Some were solemn, some quietly moved. 1 or 2 looked down, clapping without letting their eyes leave the table, unable perhaps to meet the weight of what sat there. Trump did not clap. He did not speak. He sat back, his arms crossed tight, the muscles in his jaw shifting like tectonic plates under strain. His eyes stayed fixed on the dog tags, not glancing, not flicking away. Fixed, as if they might burn him if he looked too long, or worse, as if they already were. The applause swelled again, a second wave that didn't need the chairwoman's approval. It rolled over the chamber, over the cameras, out into every broadcast in the country. In living rooms, people sat up straighter. In bars, conversations quieted. In hospital waiting rooms, strangers turned to each other, not to speak, but to share the moment. Jasmine didn't raise her hands. She didn't signal for quiet. She let it happen, let it build until it found its own natural end. When the clapping tapered, the room did not return to its old rhythm. Something had shifted too far to go back. The Bible, the funeral sash, the cross, the sermon notes, the dog tags. 5 small ordinary things, and yet they had remade the room's balance entirely. Trump leaned forward once, as if about to speak, but stopped. Whatever words had been ready seemed to wither before they reached his mouth. The chairwoman's gavel rested untouched beside her. She didn't lift it. She didn't have to. The hearing wasn't over on paper, but everyone in the room knew it had already ended. A photographer in the gallery leaned just far enough to capture the shot. Jasmine in profile, the artifacts lined before her, Trump blurred in the background, staring at the tags. That image would run above headlines by morning. It didn't need a caption. The applause had left behind a hum in the chamber, quiet but alive, the way air feels charged before rain. Jasmine glanced once more toward the camera, not to speak again, but to hold the gaze for a final beat. It was a look that said, "You saw it. You know." Then she looked down at her father's sermon notes. Her fingers brushed the paper's edge, grounding herself not in the wind, but in the man whose life had made it possible. Trump still sat frozen, his stare locked on the tags. It wasn't anger in his face now. It was something colder, recognition perhaps, that he had no move left to make that wouldn't sound small in the shadow of what had just happened. The chairwoman finally spoke. "This committee will reconvene tomorrow." Her voice was formal, procedural, but everyone heard the subtext. "We've seen enough for today. No gavel strike, no theatrical close. Just the scrape of chairs, the shuffle of papers, and the lingering image of a man out-talked without being spoken over." And as the cameras cut to commercial, one truth settled over the nation. In a battle built on noise, Jasmine Crockett had won with quiet. ChatGPT said, "In the end, it wasn't the loudest voice that carried the day, but the one that spoke without needing to shout." Jasmine Crockett reminded a nation that true power is not in what we claim, but in what we give, and that legacy is measured in the lives we lift, not the monuments we build to ourselves. In a world quick to forget, she proved that memory, honest, unshakable memory, is the quiet force that shapes history, and the surest path to becoming the kind of person whose absence would be felt as deeply as their presence. If this story made you stop, don't just keep scrolling. Sit with it, share it, let it spark a conversation that matters. Like, comment, and send it to someone who still believes a legacy is built in people, not in towers. Subscribe to Harrison Stories, where the quiet moments hit louder than the noise. Hit the bell, because the next chapter won't play it safe. It will be sharp, uncomfortable, and it might just change the way you see power, service, and truth. This is a fictional dramatization inspired by real acts of injustice and the courage to answer them. Any resemblance to actual people or events is either coincidental or intentionally symbolic for public reflection and critique. Thank you for watching, because justice isn't granted. It's built one voice at a time. This is Harrison Stories.